Well, James, this is the first time we've met.
But thanks for the royalties.
I recall Wisconsin Death Trip, 96, 98, something like that?
99 was when it was
99.
finished.
And had a very powerful impact, that film, right? But it seemed to me that it was a very early James Marsh, in a sense. You were finding yourself as a filmmaker.
I guess it was a different kind of proposition than this. It was a much more dramatised documentary. It was all dramatised, essentially. And it was a very unusual kind of film to try and pull off. It had no shape, no structure, no form. It was all a succession, almost an incantation of little stories. And it was very influenced by a film called Man with a Movie Camera, which was a Bertov film from the Soviet Union in the late 20s. And I guess it was kind of experimental, if that's not a terrible word to use.
But it is a bad word to use.
These days it probably is, yeah. But it definitely was the first film I made with the cinema in mind, I guess.
This film, or
Death Trip.
Death Trip, yeah. Right. It's interesting because that was a highly formal and highly structured film. And there's a way in which the three films I know of your work, obviously Man on Wire and this film now, that in a sense you have moved away from very formal control, in a way. This last film, for me at least, is the least formally controlled of the three.
Yeah, I think I got much more interested in pure narrative. And Wisconsin Death Trip is an exercise, almost an anti-narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this is very much focused on story, a story that hopefully exposes ideas and has ideas embedded in the very telling of the story, that you just generate intriguing questions and you don't actually answer or resolve in the film, because I don't think they are resolvable.
Sure.
So yeah, I guess Man on Wire had quite a lot more reconstructions than this one. This has very few, less than people think actually.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the, if you will, the formal elements in the progression I'm talking about. We can feel fewer. Also, it's interesting. I'm reading that a film by Wiseman called Primate. Is that correct? Which I haven't seen.
Oh, it's great.
Was a big influence on you?
Well, it was just an important reminder of the nature of the task here, which was to study all the primates involved. I.e., primates called primate for a very good reason. It's about humans and the animals, which are largely higher primates in this facility in Texas. And so that film just reminded me to be honest about all the behaviour in the story, not just the chimpanzee, and to see what kind of behaviour he flushed out in us.
Well, I mean, for me, this is really a story about human behaviour, and I do agree with Bob and the Grateful Dead. I have to say that, But it seems that the film really is Nim's the mirror.
Well, yes, I think the mirror is being offered both ways. Also, he's studying us to survive, and that's what he's doing. He's reading us. In the first 5 years of his life, he doesn't know what a chimpanzee is, apart from looking in the mirror and seeing himself. So, hence the comedy of the early part of the story, this comedy of misunderstanding and his wild behaviour emerging in a controlled human environment. You can't inhibit that behaviour. That was the nature of the experiment. Can you inhibit a chimpanzee's hardwired behaviour? Well, clearly you can't, as the film, I think, shows.
I'd like to come out and ask questions in just 1 minute, but I just sort of have uncovered it. I'm sure Ben's got a cracker. But I just want to ask one more question, really, in that has it changed you? Have you, at the end of this process, personally taken a stand or become more involved or done something else in terms of experiments on that?
I wish I could tell you that I had, but that wasn't the angle I was coming at it from. It was a story I wanted to tell that I felt had interesting ideas in it. It's not really an activist film. And I think those issues are really quite complicated. And as you see, the vet in the film, Jim Mahoney, has a very interesting kind of character. He's a good man in a bad world. And so I wish I could tell you that I was now campaigning for animal rights.
No, I'm not sure that's necessary. I'm just that there's an interesting element. I'm thinking of Man on Wire, which is essentially anti-authoritarian. It's about a single man, in some respects, overcoming a huge bureaucracy and a corporation and the local, the state of New York and so the city of New York to do something which is a dream of his, to realize his dream. And there's a way in which here this leads you. I mean, it's a quite bleak picture of humankind, really, but it's very political.
I guess it is by implication, but there's so many other ideas too that I think, again, we don't necessarily articulate in the film, but the film offers the audience really to complete it for themselves, which is the kind of films I like to make and like to watch as well, that you're I don't spoon feed some little moral to you at the end. That doesn't feel, I think the story is too interesting to be a vehicle for an activist point of view. That's the story I chose to tell. Of course, I have sympathy with some of those issues, but I don't think that's the kind of film I want to make at the moment, or maybe ever.
Didn't you make The Burger and the Kid?
Yeah, I did, yeah.
And you haven't seen that, Tom?
No, I haven't, no.
It's criminal.
Indeed.
That was a film that made me want to make documentaries.
Oh, that's good. Thank you for remembering it. It was
It's a total classic.
actually the first film I made that I was kind of pleased with when I finished it. I thought I did a pretty good job with that. Don't know how I say it. And
Where did that come?
I made that film in '95, and I was actually getting fired from the BBC as I was making it.
Oh, right.
It was the last time
I remember the film, but I didn't see it. It's about Presley's
favourites.
That's right, and that was your first big one, wasn't it?
It was an arena film from the mid-90s, and I made a bunch of other films before then, but that was one where I think I found a kind of style that I liked. It was obviously influenced by other people, as we all have been. But that one was, it had recipes in. You can go and cook his favourite dinners if you want to.
So how do you think you've changed as a filmmaker since then?
Oh goodness, what an interesting question. I don't really analyse what there's lots of directors here too. I don't really analyse what I'm doing. You kind of just find the irresistible subject and you go at it and go at it and go at it. There's no kind of, for me, I'm not Michael Moore running around trying to change the world and getting the weather lapels and shouting at it for a couple of hours. But I think clearly your style evolves, you become more confident in what you're doing. I've made 3 features now, feature films, which definitely have influenced the way I make documentaries, with writing screenplays and dealing with structure and the stuff of dramatic choice and decisions and how characters create a story. And definitely Man on Wire wouldn't have happened without shooting a film I'd written called The King, which no one saw, and those that did see it hated it, it would seem more or less. That was very important, because I worked through a lot of, ideas.
Some of your films like that, I think, Dan.
A lot of people hate them.
I'll come here in a moment. You had a question here?
How did you come about the story? And what stage did you, was it the fact that you had the archive there, or was it just the fact that there were so many aspects to the story?
It was a book, basically, that was written, a biography of Nim, written by someone who has much more of an animal rights kind of agenda. And we extracted from that what I thought was a dramatic story focused on the chimpanzee and his life story, essentially. And I assumed, and I was proved correct, there'd be lots of archive film because of the nature of what was going on, that he was an experiment, and therefore that experiment would have been recorded, documented, photographed. And we found lots of other archive we weren't expecting to find. That stuff in the medical lab, we had no idea that existed before we started the film. Likewise, that extraordinary encounter he has with his first chimpanzee in Oklahoma, that was footage we didn't know existed when we started the movies. So you make your own luck often when you're pursuing a subject. You just keep going and going until you find what you think might be there, and you get given gifts along the way. But certainly the archive made it very viable as a film, because that's what we were looking for, is the raw materials for a documentary are often archive-based.
I thought the film was great, and I don't want to sound critical.
Go on. I think it's a
But I get the impression that, obviously it is a great story, dramatically, narratively. But I think you're being slightly, I'm not quite sure what the word is, but at the heart of that film is a film about our position as a species on this planet. It's about morality, it's about philosophy, it's about rights of our species, other species. And sort of discount what I'm saying, but I get the feeling possibly you started off thinking, here's a great story. Possibly, as you got into it, you realised, this must have questioned your own feelings of morality, philosophy, politics.
That's why I made the film, of course.
It's big questions, but I think to deny that at the end it's just a story, it's up to people to make up their own minds, is slightly being, it is posing very, very big specific questions about our
but they're
duties to
questions,
other animals.
not points of view, I think. That's what I meant by that. I'm not trying to be disingenuous, but it's more that I don't want to complete the moral conclusions of the films. I'm not sure that I'm the person to do that.
But what are you? You must have a moral conclusion. You can't make a film like that without having a moral conclusion, surely.
Well, I wouldn't say that I do have a moral conclusion. I think that the questions of the film are rather more complicated than just a simple moral to be extracted. I think there are many different questions embedded in that story, and I think my duty as I saw it was to tell the story as well as I could and make the selections, as you know, that we all do, and give it an emphasis and pose those questions, but pose them in narrative terms, not in a dry discussion of morals or science or academia. So of course I had, I guess, feelings about the professor that weren't positive, to say the least. But
Can I just disagree a little bit here? Because I thought the film was very, very clear in its point of view. I think you had a very definite agenda, and whether the agenda was simply to try and tell the truth. But you drew me continually to the human failure to actually understand the implications and consequences of our actions.
Well, I think the basic question
and
is...
that is huge with regard to wild animals, with regard to other species. That is a huge statement in the current world we live.
I think that for me there's an original sin in the film, which is taking a young baby from its mother. Whatever species you're doing that to, there's something transgressive about that. And that for me is that's as far as I would go. There's an original sin that I think is a sin, literally, a transgression. It's against the natural order. And what then follows on from that is my narrative, if you like. So I would definitely identify that as something that I felt strongly about and had a kind of moral position on, if you like. But I still can maintain the idea that I want to pose questions as opposed to answer them.
Tom, could you share your microphone?
Oh, right. All right, okay. Well, maybe I'll...
We can swap.
Well.
This is a better one. I mean, it's much better. What do you think we've done right?
Get our priorities right. We've got a question over here and we'll come back with it. Yeah.
I'm very curious about the process that you used for the graphic look for the film, which I thought was terrific, by the way. But, I mean, we all, well, those of us who are directors or producers or whatever, know that you start with a blank sheet of paper. I happen to know that you and Simon came across this film, the story, quite early on, and therefore you had a book, but nothing else. And the look of the film is very, very distinctive and extremely interesting, I think. And I don't know how much you can let us into the process by which the look of the film developed. I think you must have shot those interviews with the Red, maybe.
Shot Red, yeah.
And the way you use graphics and the way you slid the shots across. Talk to us a bit about, if you can, the process by which you arrived at what we see.
Well, the graphics are a good point in question because the film's about language and language acquisition and words. I mean, obviously we're using written words, but it felt to me that I wanted to show you in this vocabulary in a kind of incremental way as he was acquiring it, and hence the boldness, if you like, of the graphics. And we worked with a company in New York who collaborated with the way they looked. And the one film I referenced was Alphaville, the Jean-Luc Godard film that uses these very bold, in-your-face, big typeface graphics. And we used the same typeface. That was an influence on how the graphics actually looks. But it felt to me that if I was dealing with language, we should have language spilling off the screen as much as possible, and try and organise kind of graphics that would not only give you information but look elegant somehow, just visually pleasing. The general process that I think was very common to documentary filmmakers, and certainly how I go about things, is I do all the interviews first. I gather all those big interviews and begin to cut the film myself and organise the kind of structure of it. Then I will go with my editor and we'll work through and refine it. And then at the very last minute I will shoot other imagery that I think the film requires to be a kind of coherent visual experience as you're watching it.
Tell me what Sheila Nevins said as you quoted Alphaville to her.
Actually, Sheila came in late to the production. She brought the film when it was finished. So we didn't have any scuffles about anything because we said, here's the film, take it or leave it, and she took it. So, but I've worked with Sheila before, and I know that she can be quite, what's the word, strident, perhaps.
In the very back.
What do you think is the advantage of telling the story in documentary rather than
Well, firstly, I'm not sure you believe it if I tell it to you as a fictionalised film, and that definitely feels to be characteristic of the films I make in documentaries. Man on Wire, again, I'm not sure anyone would believe that story if we made it up. So that feels like already, you know, that's an indication that you have to use a documentary form because real life is so utterly preposterous and surprising. Plus the characters, when you meet them, the real people, they're just so interesting and fascinating as human beings, and their relationship with Nim was so complicated. I'm not sure that you could get that out in a drama. Maybe you could, but I think someone wants to remake the film as a sort of Hollywood movie, and good luck to them. The same was true of Man on Wire. But it seems to me that these kinds of stories, this is what documentaries are for, when they can tell you something that is so incredible that you wouldn't believe it if we made it up.
I have Dan in the back here.
I was interested in your choices for the sound design of the film, because you seem to, rather counterintuitively, I thought, completely avoided any kind of animal sounds for most of the film until the kind of monkey gets into until Nim gets into the kind of dark side inside the cages, at which point all those kind of expected chimp sounds suddenly burst out. And it felt like it was quite deliberate, and I wondered if you could just throw some light on that.
Well, it was because he's been taught, human language in the first 5 years of his life. He's not around chimpanzees, and so actually his own repertoire of chimpanzee sounds, hoots and grunts, what they use in the wild, he didn't know what they were. So he didn't actually make a lot of chimpanzee noises when he was with the family. So
did you make that up, or did you know that?
No, I don't know that. That's what I discovered by talking to people. And so when he gets to the chimpanzees, the film, as you rightly pointed out, begins to have quite a bit more kind of animal chimpanzee noise in it. For that reason, that was his experience. He didn't make those kind of noises, he was around chimpanzees. And the sound design generally is, I think, fairly discreet in the film. Man on Wire, the sound design was really quite full on and interventionist. This is a bit more discreet, I think, for very obvious reasons, because it's a natural animal. You want to hear what he's got to, how it sounds like. But generally, your point is a good one and a correct one, that the film progresses sound-wise as it unfolds.
What reaction did you get from the interviewees, particularly Professor Terrace?
Well, the film went to Sundance and everyone came, but on the proviso he didn't come, so 3 of them said, well, if he's coming, I'm not coming. So he had to make a choice. So I persuaded him not to come. He saw the film simultaneously in New York. And he wrote me a fairly curt email saying that he felt that we'd done a disservice to the science of the project, not that I could see the great deal of science in the project as conducted by him. But that said, he wasn't overly antagonistic. He's since been on NPR in America, and the most journalists who were interviewing has been a lot more hostile on a sort of personal level. But he did what he did, and he hasn't taken issue with the facts of the film. And what I did in the film was essentially remove his privileges as a professor and make him into one of a number of people who witnessed aspects of Nim's life, and therefore, for the first time, his actions were put in the context of other people's actions. The playing field was level, finally, and he's not used to that. And I think he was surprised at the vehemence of the reaction he had in some of the people involved.
The one character I wanted to know more about was, I'm sure there was a time, but was it Mahoney, the guy who does the experiments?
Yeah.
And because he seems to change, and that's, he does something. He sets free some of these chimpanzees. He's the devil, and I just wondered afterwards, has his character been transformed? What's gone on?
That's interesting. What I try to do is keep the film rigorously about Nim and not get too sidetracked into there's many other. That guy, Dr. Lemon's a fascinating character as well. With Mahoney, I think he was always a good man in a very bad world and genuinely cared for the animals that he was essentially inflicting pain on. That's not a contradiction, it is a contradiction in terms. That said, towards the end of his career, I think he became sick of what he was doing. He says as much. And that when his laboratory was closed down, those chimps are going to go to an even worse place, and probably they will die within 1 or 2 years from the experiments that can be done on them. So he then, as you saw, liberates about 67 chimpanzees he managed to sneak out of his facility and put them in various refuges, which is his penance, I guess, for a lifetime of inflicting suffering on animals that he genuinely cared for. It's a very interesting paradox.
Do you think any of the people in the film saw themselves, okay, we have the professor, and it was interesting that his, maybe his realization of how the people saw him through your eyes, but did other people find the film who were involved in Nim's life, did they find the film helped them see their contribution, or maybe their abuse, or whatever? Did it change people who...
I think for many people it was a very cathartic experience. Clearly there were very paradoxical feelings of work, particularly for the women who were asked to be his mother, which is an emotionally complicated role of nurturing. And I think, some people felt guilty, and a guilty mind likes to confess, perhaps. So I think a lot of people in the film took the opportunity to kind of have this catharsis with a story that meant a lot to them, and an animal they genuinely cared for and didn't always do right by. And so kind of harvest that at the point of your interviews. And it has clearly an emotional dimension to it that the film exploits, if that's the right word to use, or uses to make the story available.
Yeah, I was just going to ask something about reconstruction. In Man on Wire, I always felt watching it, I was perfectly happy with the reconstruction because it felt so much like a kind of heist movie. It was crying out for that, and it worked really, really well. And here, although I really enjoyed the film, really liked it a lot, I wondered whether you ever thought you might not need reconstruction, because I found I'm probably wrong, but it felt like it's concentrated in the early sequences of it.
Yeah, it's things you wouldn't know. I was very conflicted about it in this film, and still have reservations about what I did, as I often do. That said, I think I needed to evoke certain scenes. I didn't try and do it in a full-on dramatic way like in Man on Wire. I tried to kind of give you echoes of what happened, that you're looking at the shadow, not the real event. So they're quite a bit more elliptical. But I did agonise that a bit, and I think I could have not done them, and the film still would have worked quite well, and perhaps there's a lesson in that for me for the future.
Well, I mean, it's not for me to answer Ben's question, but it does strike me that there's a way in which, at least the films I know of your work, is that you become more relaxed as you mature as a filmmaker, and in a sense, you're less concerned with the surface qualities of the work, and more concerned, if you will, with the deeper meaning of it.
That's probably true. Not that I would analyse my own work that way, but certainly in Wisconsin Death, for those that have seen it, it's an exciting formality in trying to, sort of visualise these little stories and make a very sort of overwhelming visual experience without really looking at the meaning of it. Whereas this is the other way around. This is about a story that I think has layers of meaning we're trying to expose. So there's a kind of maybe a progression or maturity, if that's the right word to use, in that approach.
In 1985, I was a researcher, and I went to Washington State to film Washoe, who you probably know is another chimpanzee. And I thought it was people interested to hear this as the directors here, because my director at the time got quite sort of connected with Washoe and his family. And one of the chimpanzees kept saying, chase me, in sign language. And the director was running around, and finally he had to get on with his job. And when he stopped chasing, the chimpanzee went like this. And so he went up to the guys in charge of the project and said, what does this mean? And he said, so that means dirty shit.
It does. And, well, interestingly enough, Nim's favourite sign was play. It's something he invented himself. And there's something very poignant about that idea that the one sign that he created isn't a request, it's not a demand for food or a joint or whatever else, it's to play, it's a collaborative thing. And Washoe was a very interesting case study too, and Nim was supposed to be the final word in language experiments because Nim was taken from his mother when he was born. Washoe was acquired when she was, I think it was a female chimpanzee, when she was 2.5. So she'd been around like chimpanzees, whereas Nim was a sort of sterile experiment where he only knew human beings for the first 5 years of his life. So this was the definitive study. And I think that the whole Washoe story is a very extraordinary, interesting one as well, and one that would also make a great film. But I knew that Nim had much more archive documentation, and therefore it would be easier to access the language issues and the story through just the weight of archive. And also Nim's story took on these very dark turns after the experiment was over, which Washoe's did not.
What I was leading up to, the question, is therefore watching Herb say that it wasn't language, it wasn't sign language. My personal experience of having watched chimpanzees, I'm wondering that you, having been through all the archive and having immersed yourself in it, how much did you or did you not agree with Herb's conclusion?
Well, I would definitely agree that with him that chimpanzees don't construct sentences with grammar. But as Bob Ingersoll shows you, there's a richness of communication that's possible between humans and chimpanzees that involves words and gestures and actual physical signs. But what Bob does is, meet the chimpanzee halfway, which Terrace did not do. Terrace had a very dry question: can a chimpanzee construct a sentence? And quite honestly, if they could, we'd all be hanging out with them, finding out what kind of weed they like or whatever else. We'd be having conversations with them, and that was the bigger objective of Project Nim, was to find out how a chimpanzee thinks, how he sees the world, what he feels, and that clearly wasn't possible to reach a kind of limit to how much we can know other species, and the rest is just projection, which you see in Nim's story all the way through. People project onto him emotions he doesn't really have, and overlook ones he does have, which is, the poignant irony of his story.
Maybe there's something wrong with your mic. Maybe it's the way you're hot. I'm just thinking maybe there's some power you give off.
Pull it away from your lips.
Which one's working best? Question in the back here.
I'm interested in your interview technique. Are they particularly long interviews? Do you spend a long time with the contributors beforehand?
Well, yeah, I try to build up a relationship before I do the interview. It feels right to do that if I'm asking people very personal